All right, everybody. Welcome to the What's New in Simcenter Femap 2301 webinar. Hopefully everybody can hear me. Chris, if there's any problems, feel free to just jump in and let me know. Chris is online as well with SDAsoftware. So today we're going to talk through a bunch of updates, and we're just going to go ahead and jump right in and try to get through some of these exciting new updates. So first off, if you're familiar with these webinars, we'll just quickly talk through the background of Structures.aero, and then we're going to jump into new functionality and updates for this release. And some of the biggest changes, at least from our perspective, is meshing and mid-surfacing improvements. There have been some extra capability added to some of the commands available in Femap there. And then the unified graphics engine is a new way for Femap to basically render things in its graphics pipeline. So that's an exciting update. And then we're also looking at analysis monitor updates and quality of life improvements they've made on that end, as well as something that we're excited about, which is new user computed output vectors, which will allow you to compute output from within Femap, which is pretty neat in a few different ways. And then the last thing we'll talk through is the Femap command finder, which is something that I think when I saw it, I was like, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I'm surprised. I'm glad that the Femap team has added that, because that's something that's present in NX and just super useful for finding commands. So let's jump into our background. We are now a company of 21 engineers. We've been growing over the past few years. We've got a combination of PhD, master's, and bachelor's degrees, but primarily bachelor's. And we all specialize in aerospace, engineering, mechanical, or engineering, science, and mechanics. But we're all experts at Femap and use Femap and Nastran every day. So some of our recent projects, if you're familiar with these webinars, you've probably seen this before. But we've kind of got our hand in a lot of different things across the industry. So that includes this, like the space side of things, also just air vehicles, and then we've also worked on a lot of UAVs and other projects. Some of the more recent ones include Dream Chaser, the Electra Tech demo. Those are some of the, and also Boom Supersonic is a big one that we've been working on a lot recently. So in addition to providing engineering services, we are also a Siemens Value-Added Reseller. So we sell all the software listed here, and we also offer a lot of training. The most common one that we offer is Femap with NX Nastran, where we sit students down and we have a lot of our engineers come through and teach like a few hour long session each, and you kind of get like the different perspective from each engineer and a lot of their like personal work habits. So that's a great thing that we offer. And then obviously we also provide expert support of Femap, Nastran, and Fibersim. So where are we on the product roadmap? Right now we are at Femap 2301, and yes, you will notice that they have switched naming schemes now. So 01 means January, 23 is obviously the year. So that seems to be the naming convention moving forward. And it looks like there will be, I think the 2301.1 is probably just a maintenance pack, and yeah, there's an M. So, but I would keep an eye out for the maintenance packs, because they generally are pretty useful and just generally improve the stability of Femap. That's something we've definitely noticed with the maintenance packs. All right, so let's jump in. First thing that we're going to talk about today, briefly actually, is Teamcenter integration. So I'm not sure how many Femap users probably aren't terribly familiar with Teamcenter, mainly because it seems to be something far more useful in the past on the design side. But now Femap is integrated with Teamcenter, at least to a degree, and that will allow you to check in and check out files, host PDM capability locally, which is one of the bigger differences from Accelerator. Accelerator's in the cloud versus Teamcenter. That might be able to be in the cloud, but I think the big benefit there is that that can be hosted locally. I know that's the big benefit for us that we're looking into. But within Femap, you'll see all the PDM related functionality has been moved to the, there's a new tab called the PDM tab. So then there's a Teamcenter, Accelerator share, and also references. That's all been consolidated there. All right, moving into the geometry improvements. So the first thing that I mentioned earlier was midsurfacing enhancements, and there are two new commands that have been added to the automatic midsurface generation dialog. And the first one is remove holes. This is fairly self-explanatory. It's basically just going to close holes in the midsurface if for one reason or another you wanted to close a bunch of holes and then use the original geometry later to project curves and make your own. For example, like if your midsurface passed through a bunch of holes at like the wrong thickness, like if there was a bunch of core ramps or something, this is something that I could potentially see this feature being useful, because then you could generate just a clean surface and then project a bunch of curves to create your own holes. And then there's also the option to keep the untrimmed midsurface. And this is basically just going to, instead of trimming the midsurface to the actual original CAD, it'll leave it extended a little bit past the original boundary. And this is helpful for if you're trying to intersect other surfaces with that. It kind of cuts out the step of after midsurfacing, if you have to go to midsurface or geometry midsurface extend to actually intersect the different surfaces in the non-manifold data. I could see this being helpful where it cuts out the extend step. So here's some geometry, a little demo that we have. You can see there's a lot of holes. There's also a lot of just different sections of thickness. So depending on like what Femap identifies as the midplane, you could cut through a lot of different thicknesses of the part and end up picking up on holes or leaving holes out. So if you leave the remove holes option turned off, this is what you'll get. And you can see, if we go back and forth, it seems like it is ignoring a lot of these other pockets that don't seem to be holes, but they're rather just pockets. But we do end up with a bunch of holes. So then if you turn on remove holes, they're obviously just gone. And then here is what happens when you leave the original geometry and you want to keep the untrimmed surface. If we go back and forth, you can kind of see how there's just the midsurface is extended, especially if you can see my mouse. Let's see. Like if you look at the forward edge or the edge closest to us here, there's a lot of jagged geometry here. And then when keep untrimmed midsurfaces is turned on, we actually end up with just a very clean edge that it might be easier to trim later on and avoid that geometry and the cleanup that would be necessary later on. So those are two pretty neat improvements to the midsurface automatic command. All right. Moving into some pre-processing enhancements, new to 2301 is support for element addition and removal, specifically in solution 401. There's a lot more included on this. So if you are interested in this aspect of the improvements, I would highly suggest reading through the What's New release notes. This is just like, there's a lot more that was added related to this. So, but it creates ELAR, ELAR2, and ELAR add entries in the Nastran input file. And one thing to note is that these are our simulation entities. So you can kind of go through the tree to get at those in the new simulation entities tab, which I guess isn't super new anymore, but they also live in the regular menus. Another pre-processing enhancement is that when creating Aerosplines, if you're using the Nastran Aero models, they now have the option to, instead of, you can basically tell a spline to reference all the boxes on a panel now, instead of all the box IDs on a specific panel at a specific point in time. So this is an option that allows you to change the resolution on an arrow panel, and the spline basically, if you have all boxes checked on, the spline will know about that. Whereas if you have it a custom and you end up changing the arrow box density on the arrow panels, the spline won't know about it. So I think this is a nice safety improvement where if you check all boxes, your spline is more connected to the panel itself and will know about updates to the boxes upstream. Previously, if you did change the resolution on an arrow panel, you'd have to go into the spline and click a button that said all boxes. And I think most people just had that as part of their standard workflow. So this is nice that you don't have to do that anymore. And it's nice that you don't have to forget it, that you don't get to forget about it and then realize it later, because I've done that. All right, improvements to groups. There are 3 key improvements here. The first one is a small change to how the group operations condense function works. And I think it actually works how most people would want it to work now. So previously, if you used group operations condense, it would condense the rules down and just use the IDs of whatever was selected for the rules. But it would pick up on, for example, if you had selected properties, I want this group to have property 1 through 50, but only 25 properties existed in the model, it would still say properties 1 through 50. So then later on, if you evaluated that group, it would pick up anything that you had added between 1 and 50. So now when you condense, it'll only contains IDs of existing entities. So in my opinion, this is a little bit safer because you don't end up with entities in your model that you're not aware of and that you didn't explicitly add to that group. So the second group functionality improvements is to the reduce to existing command. And this works a lot like the condense feature, but it updates each rule type to contain its existing entities. So instead of condensing down to the ID rules, basically instead of condensing down to the IDs of the entities themselves, it will condense the properties. Like, for example, if you have properties 1 through 50 in your group rule, and you pick reduce to existing, it'll maintain that rule, but it'll only have that rule for properties that exist in the model. These are kind of hard to think about. These are kind of, I would say probably a little bit less used group operations, at least in my experience, though I'm sure for other people they use these all the time. And then also, this one is almost like a bug fix in my opinion, but they've now updated the automatic add. I guess it's not a button, but like when you turn on automatic add now, when you renumber something into when you renumber something, it won't see that as a new entity and add it to the group. Previously, if you renumbered an entity, there were situations where it would see the renumbered entity and think it was new and then add it to the group. And then I know here at SDA, we've had situations where we've just been super confused because some random entity ended up in a group, which you never added it. And it's not new, but you had renumbered it. So I think these are kind of aimed at making some of these group commands a little bit more intuitive, because I know, at least for me, some of these have not been super intuitive, and maybe that's why I haven't used them in the past as much as others. Okay, getting into the meshing enhancements. Now, Femap now supports mesh points when you're using the body mesher. So this one's fairly self-explanatory, but I think previously it would just ignore mesh points, so you wouldn't have a node at those points on the surface. And now it can handle that. And also, there's an option now for projecting the mid-side nodes. If you have like a higher order elements, you can now project those to the associated surfaces within a certain distortion angle tolerance. So you can see here, if we zoom in on this mesh on the left, there's a node at the mesh point. And again, this is an improvement to the body mesher. So obviously, previously, if you just used a regular mesher on a surface, you would get the associativity. All right, another feature that I can't say that I use something like this a lot, but I could see how it'd be insanely satisfying if you do use this a lot. Basically, now if you use the mesh on mesh command, you can refine and unrefine beam elements that are also coincident with your original mesh. This is fairly self-explanatory. So, but you can see you can use it to refine and unrefine, which is actually pretty neat. For example, if you have a detailed model that you were provided, but you needed to speed up iteration in a certain area, you could unrefine large sections of it in order to get faster runtimes on a model like this. So another improvement to the meshing capabilities of Femap is the edge imprinting option for the mesh sizing propagation options. Basically, what this will do is it'll help close gaps. For example, if you have mid surfaces that are not exactly touching, kind of like I was talking about earlier, instead of using the geometry mid-surface extend command to get intersections and then non-manifold add and then delete off all the sliver surfaces to get a nice clean intersecting solid. This will help with things like that. Where you can just, instead of doing all that work, use the edge imprinting options here, and Femap should take care of that for you. And then there are a few miscellaneous improvements in meshing as well. One of them is on geometry preparation. There's a confirmation which it's basically a checkbox which will prevent you from closing up internal voids in a part. If, for example, you have a solid with hollow sections in it that you might not know that it was previously being filled in by the preparation commands. So now there's control over that. Yeah, and like this says here, it's basically just helping you prevent accidentally suppressing a void or something like that. And then these are kind of, in my opinion, it's almost bug fixes, but the hex mesh bodies command, which again is the new functionality in Femap, where you can create a actually, I think this is related to the new hex mesher, but basically there's a fix where it'll actually retain the mesh sizing in specific cases. And then there's also improvements to the cohesive mesher, which basically improves the robustness of inserting cohesive elements. All right, moving on to performance improvements. So the unified graphics architecture is part of a performance improvement that Femap has been rolling out at least one release back. But at this point, they have added a checkbox in the preferences, which is by default on. So there's nothing that you have to do to take advantage of this out of the box. But it's a better experience for the user in quality, performance, and hardware. And it's actually supposed to work better with Intel graphics. So this is actually being deployed continuously, so it's not actually at its full functionality yet. It'll get better over time. And I think here you can see it currently supports a lot of geometry, and they're going to add in a lot of other things later on. But it's a continuation of the performance graphics integration, the best possible. But basically, moving forward, you should only have to use the unified architecture instead of changing a lot of different settings. For example, if there was some weird incompatibility with your graphics card or something like that. And then the miscellaneous performance improvements. One of the big things is adding a large number of nodal, elemental, and geometric loads and constraints to the data table has been improved, as well as adding and updating columns in the data table API object. And in one case, there was a 33x improvement for a free body call. This kind of seems like a bug fix, but I think it is kind of important to highlight here that if you're working in Femap and something takes forever and it seems like it shouldn't be, I know I sometimes just kind of accept it as like, this is just how long it takes. It's probably like doing a bunch of work, but I think this kind of highlights there are things in Femap that can be improved. So if you notice something like this, reach out to us or someone who's in contact with the Femap development team. And I know there have been several instances of something like this where we've reached out and said, hey, like this doesn't seem right. And then they very quickly said, yeah, you're exactly right. We'll get that fixed. And I think this is something like that. So other improvements are loading faceted geometry. We've got some speed boosts there, and then also updating a mesh in the toolbox with rigid sizing, and if you have propagate sizing turned off. Sounds like it was doing some duplicate work there. All right. Some of the next updates are in the analysis monitor. There's new graphics here, or like indicators, I would say more like it, that tell you if your model ran successfully, if it failed out, if it is running, or if it's still in the queue. And that's kind of what the green square, red square, green thumbs up, and red thumbs down mean. I've been using this for maybe a week now, and it's been pretty nice to be able to see, oh, like this is the analysis I was running, it failed. Kind of just like directs your attention to those runs, that type of thing. So in addition to the new indicators, they've also added some options when you right-click on an analysis set. The first one is continue running analysis queue, which that's an option. For example, if you pick all these and you try to run all of them at the same time, it's going to queue those up, right? And if one fails out, it might stop the whole queue, right? So you can right-click and continue running the queue there. So that's nice. You can also clear the analysis queue, load results, and you can bring up the analysis monitor pane, which is, I know there have been times when I've closed out the analysis monitor by accident. So now you can, if you know which analysis was running, you can click on it and pull that back up. So another improvement in terms of analysis sets is that the very first window that opens up if you modify an analysis set, where you specify the program, Nastran, and the type, for example here buckling, is that it'll tell you which solution it's actually using, which is, I think this is mostly an improvement for new users, because I know when I first started, I was talking to someone about a problem that I was running into. I would just say like, yeah, I'm running buckling. And they're like, oh, so you're running solution 105. And I would have no idea what they were talking about. So this kind of like closes the loop on that type of thing. So you don't have to go back into the Nastran documentation and find the one page that contains the solution map. So yeah, just a little bit clearer on what's actually being run there. All right, post-processing improvements. This is probably one of the bigger updates for this release, with the others being probably Teamcenter support. But the computed vectors allow you to basically compute your own output and place those in the database. And you can access this via the model output computed vectors command. And this is what pops up when you go into this dialog. So the first thing you'll notice is there is a when to compute section at the top, and basically you can say, hey, I want to set some settings up and compute these vectors automatically when I read or create results. Or you can say, hey, I'm in this dialog and I want to create this output now from existing output files that I've connected to. And there are two different types of computed vectors. There are standard, which come built into Femap, and then there are user-defined. Standard lets you select from this list here. You can compute elemental results. You can compute plate solid failure theories, laminate failure theories, and you can also envelope results. And again, you can run this when you read or create results or at the time of run, which is pretty neat. And down at the bottom, you'll see there is there are two options. One is for loading functions from a library. And then you can also save, I think this allows you to save a configuration to a file for loading it later. So that's for For example, if you do this all the time and you get really tired of coming into this dialog and setting it up, I think you can save how you've set it up for loading it in later. And you can also go into the preferences dialog in Femap and map to that file so that you don't have to keep going into this dialog and loading it in every time. So the other type are the user-defined output vectors, and this is much more customizable. There seems to be a lot of potential here that we're still investigating here at SDA. But the three different types are combined, which obviously you can create a linear combination or RSS combination of different output vector IDs. You can envelope output, and then you can also call an API script to create computed vectors as well. And I think the API script is probably what we're most interested in, and we'll probably end up doing a webinar on that at some point, so keep an eye out. And then here are the different dialogues that come up if you choose combination, envelope, or API script. So you can see here for combination, there's the option to do linear or RSS combination. You can scale different vectors and then pick the vectors that you want to add to the combination. And it looks like the same thing is available for the envelope options, except you choose the envelope type. And then obviously there's the API script dialog as well. And then like the standard vectors, there's also the option to auto run these based on when the results are read or created, or if you want to just run it now to get the output vectors that you're interested in. All right, moving on from the computed vectors, Femap has updated the data conversion options fairly broadly across the entire Femap interface. So anytime you see, or you would expect to see average, max abs, min abs, they've actually added in the max abs and min abs. So you now have a bunch of different options here for the data conversion, and this is present in meshing toolbox, for example. If you're choosing the data conversion options there, obviously it's present in the contour options here, but you'll see that across the entire Femap interface, this has been updated in all the different scenarios where you'd be computing averages or taking envelopes, that type of thing. So another post-processing improvement is that if you are a Flutter engineer and you do use the PKNL, no looping Flutter method, I think previously there would be no way for reading in the damping or frequency plots. So now Femap can actually handle reading that in and generate the plots for you. And again, a PKNL method is just if you're running sets of density Mach number and velocities instead of sweeping through like all the possible combinations. And the reason for this is that the PK solver outputs the data in a different format than the PKNL, so they had to update the function readers to be able to handle that. Okay, another improvement is that you can now attach to a Simcenter HDF5 file, and this is basically a new type of output file that is more structured than an OP2. And I think MSC Nastran can output this type of file, and now Simcenter Nastran too. I think from like a Simcenter 3D side. However, I don't think you can generate an SDASoftware file from Femap specifically. So I think this is like they're supporting some future functionality that's coming. But if you are interested in the SDASoftware file format, which is an extension of the HDF5 file format, I would suggest looking that up and reading about it. And then finally, we've gotten to the command finder. Pretty excited about this, especially for new users. I know there's so many different ways to do things in Femap, so it'll be nice to just search instead of having to dig around in the menus. And maybe people will find things that they never knew about. I know I have with this feature already. So pretty self-explanatory. You can just search for different commands now, much like NX can, and lots of other softwares. And then obviously there have been API improvements. Most of these are bringing the API up to date with all the improvements that have been made for this version. So obviously they've added the computed vectors object, and you can access all the computed vectors functionality via the API. And then obviously they've added support for the element add remove object, updated the group commands. One thing that we haven't covered yet is I think this is just a new function that they've added to the API, but I don't think it's anything new added in the user interface, but you can now access the mesh editing split command via the API. And then same thing with the solid cleanup tool and the surface. Basically, the Midsurfacing API command has been updated with the remove holes and keep untrimmed surface options. And then some miscellaneous curve split options have been added as well in the API. And then the last thing that I want to note is that at least it seems to me like there are a lot of corrections that have been made in this version. So if you go into the Femap documentation and look at the README file, you can scroll through the different corrections that they've made. And I've noticed a couple bugs that I've noticed have been fixed. So that's really nice. And it seems like there are a lot of stability improvements. So you'll probably notice less crashes, that type of thing. So it really seems like they've been working hard to improve the stability of the program too, which is, I think, something that we all appreciate, especially when you've been working on something for a few hours and have forgotten to save for a while and run into a crash or something like that. So that's why I always download the maintenance packs, because I'm trying to avoid situations like that. And I think this is kind of in line with one of those. There's a lot of stability updates for this. Anyway, that's all we have for today. Some exciting updates for Femap this time around, and I'm already excited for the new version. Hopefully they come up with even more productivity improvement features. So if you have any questions, feel free to shoot me an email. And if you have any questions about pricing or want to see a demo, feel free to contact Keith, our Director of Sales. And if anybody has any questions now, I'll be happy to try to answer them as best I can. And if you do have a question, there should be a way to enter them in the webinar interface. But yeah, thank you guys for your attention, and we'll see you for the release of 2306 in a couple months.